Good evening. I am Robin Kelsey. I'm Dean of Arts and Humanities and a professor in the History of Art and Architecture department. And my role this evening is very pleasurable and limited. That is, I'm here to greet you on behalf of the Environment Forum and to express my excitement for this event, and also to note that it is co-sponsored with the Vice Provost for Climate and Sustainability, and we're very grateful for that. My colleague in the History Department, Ian Miller, and I started the Environment Forum at the Mahindra Humanities Center some years ago before I became Dean. Recently, Ian peeled off to do other things, and Sarah Dimmick has been directing the forum with me, but she's on leave this year, so I'm flying solo. Fortunately, I get tremendous support always from the Mahindra Humanities Center. Susanna Clark, the director, Steve Beal, the executive director, Mary McKinnon, and the whole team who do such a fantastic job with all these events and with supporting us with the Environment Forum. The intention behind the forum was not only to bring the environment and environmental issues into conversation with the humanities, but actually open the humanities to being fundamentally changed by that conversation. And I'm very excited about tonight's event. But I've pretty much exhausted my role. I'm going to now introduce the introducer of tonight's event, and that is Makita Best. Makita is the Richard B. Menchel Curator of Photography and the interim head of the Modern and Contemporary Department of the Harvard Art Museums. She curated last year a fantastic show I hope many of you saw called Devour the Land, American Landscape Photography since the 1970s. She's a leading light in the Art Museum and at the university, and it's my great pleasure to turn the microphone over to Makita.
Thank you. Thanks, Robin. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers. It's especially great to meet Dr. Crawford in person after meeting you virtually last year in conjunction with my exhibition. I first learned about Dr. Crawford's research on the military's use of fossil fuels in 2019 when I read her paper, Pentagon Fuel Use, Climate Change, and the Costs of War. I was acquiring photographs for the Harvard Art Museums that depicted a region in central Louisiana where there is a large concentration of fossil fuel production. Stacy Kranitz's deep, dense compositions of fences and foliage are emblematic of what Dr. Crawford describes in her current book as the deep cycle, or the relationship between economic growth, fossil fuel use, American wars, and foreign oil dependency. Indeed, by recognizing the fact that these corporations operate on the same lands where enslaved peoples once worked, Kranitz deepens the connections to histories of war and economic power. Dr. Crawford introduced me to the concept of climate change as a threat multiplier, and thus I began to see works like Kranitz's as landscapes of war. In her 2019 paper, Dr. Crawford pointed out that the U.S. is preparing for threats of attack from human adversaries, while global warming is the most certain and immediate of any of the threats the U.S. faces over the next several decades. Now, with such events as the publication of the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the ongoing Russian war on Ukraine have prompted renewed discussions of oil, conflict, and climate, Dr. Crawford has published her new book, The Pentagon, Climate Change and War. The book provides perspectives on the links between the U.S. military and mainstream climate science, for example, and an especially enlightening section to me was her writing on the ways the military influenced the development of modern climate science. After she earned her PhD in political science from MIT, Dr. Crawford embarked on an extraordinarily prolific career of writing for scholarly journals and general interest media, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, and the Chronicle of Higher Education. In addition to the book we've all gathered here to hear about today, Dr. Crawford is the author of Accountability for Killing, Moral Responsibility for Collateral Damage in America's Post-9/11 Wars, published in 2013. She was a co-winner of the 2003 American Political Science Association's Jervis and Schroeder Award for Best Book in Environmental History and Politics. Another book was Argument and Change in World Politics, Ethics, Decolonization, and Humanitarian Intervention. Consistent in her scholarship is her interest in competing values and notions of individual and collective moral responsibility, as she has written, quote, "Military organizations are moral agents," and a focus on pathways for institutional change. Another notable feature of Dr. Crawford's work is the sheer amount of data she offers. One of her peers made the observation that, quote, "She single-handedly gathers and analyzes data of such a vast quantity that the result resembles an NGO rather than an individual." It's not an NGO, but Dr. Crawford is also one of the founders of the Cost of War Project at Brown University's Watson Institute, which she co-directs with Catherine Lutz and Stephanie Saville. Begun in 2010, the team includes 50 scholars, legal experts, human rights practitioners, and physicians. Cost of War uses research and their website to, quote, "foster democratic discussion of the post-9/11 wars in Iraq and Afghanistan by providing the fullest possible account of their human, economic, and political costs, and to foster better informed public policies." Dr. Crawford is a Montague Burton Chair in International Relations at Oxford University. Previously, she was professor and chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University. And since 2017, she has served on the board of the Nuclear Nonproliferation Advocacy Organization, Council for a Livable World. She also serves on the editorial boards of the Journal of Political Philosophy and Global Perspectives. Tonight, Dr. Crawford will be in conversation with Dr. Catherine C. Kink. Dr. Sinkink is the Ryan Family Professor of Human Rights and Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. She works on international norms and institutions, transnational advocacy networks, the impact of human rights law and policies, and transitional justice. Her many publications include The Hidden Face of Rights Toward a Politics of Responsibilities, Evidence for Hope, Making Human Rights Work in the 21st Century, The Justice Cascade, How Human Rights Prosecutions Are Changing World Politics. She is a member of the American Philosophical Society, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the Council on Foreign Relations. Please welcome Dr. C. Kink and Dr. Crawford.
You know, that introduction was really beautiful, and I thank you for it. But I want to begin by saying thanks to all of you who are my friends and colleagues who've come to this event. And in particular, I'm going to recognize two people who are instrumental in this work that I'm talking about today. Right here are Nathan Phillips and Anna Henchman, people I taught with. Dr. Best mentioned the paper in 2019, but this work actually began as part of a class on climate change at Boston University, where we were trying to help students understand the effects of climate change as a global challenge. And one of the things that I learned from both of them is the importance of a fresh perspective and being very clear, and thank you so much. And the other professors aren't here, sadly. But they were Adam Sweeting and Les Kaufman. So what you're seeing here is the most high-tech you're going to see in this presentation, that little zipper thing. All right, so what I want to do today is actually run through some of the major arguments in this book, which I wrote for MIT Press, and I thank Anthony Zanino and my acquiring editor, Beth Clevenger. I don't know if you're here, but thank you so much for forcing me to write it basically at knife point, really fast. So all errors are there, my fault. Okay, so the theme that I'm going to talk about today, the themes are several. I mean, first is the scale of U.S. military missions. I'm just going to give you some data and go very quickly through that, because what I really want to get at is this deep cycle that was mentioned earlier, of war as a driver of emissions and industrialization. And then I'd like to talk about the military's role in climate science and climate change negotiations, again, breezing through that very quickly, and talk about how the military thinks about climate change. Get to the fact that there's securitization and militarization. I'm going to explain those terms happening right now, and it has been for the last 50 years with the military and climate change. And then I'll talk about the way that the military is thinking about resilience and adaptation and mitigation and the question of war. So there's many ways to think about emissions. Last year, the Pentagon's emissions were 51 million metric tons. The year before that, they were 51 million metric tons. In 2019, they were 54 or 55 million metric tons CO2 equivalent. And that's enormous. And what I wanted to do with this slide is basically just have you think about emissions per capita. The military's emissions per capita are more intense than civilian emissions. That's the point here, right? So the military is a very intensive user of fossil fuel, and military industry is as well. And what we have on this slide is a kind of perspective that I think we rarely get, which is that energy consumption of the entire US government is dominated by the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense is the world's largest single institutional greenhouse gas emitter. It's the United States' largest energy user, institutionally, single energy user. What this slide also shows is that the share of total US government energy consumption, it's very hard to see this, but it hints that it's actually declining. The DoD's energy consumption is actually declining. So it was around 87% of all US government energy consumption was the military, the DoD, and now it's about 76%, still the largest user. So these are the numbers right here that I began to show in the 2019 paper, and I've extended the calculations and the reporting into the present. And what I'm showing here is that DoD emissions of greenhouse gases, mostly carbon, but also methane and nitrous oxide, are fluctuating. And you can see that they fluctuate with periods of war. What I wasn't able to calculate, because I can't find the data, are emissions before 1975. And those, I imagine, were much higher. And what you're seeing is a post-Vietnam decline in emissions. And the calculations that I did were based on, just in case you're interested, the raw fuel use on bases and installations and in equipment. So how much fuel was an aircraft using? So I got the data from the Department of Energy, and then I just did the math. It was simple multiplication and conversions. So one thing to note is the overall decline since the Vietnam War. You also see spikes depending on what's happening. So there's a spike in the Reagan buildup, and there's a spike in 1991 with the Gulf War. That's the highest on the chart here, 110 million metric ton CO2 equivalent. And then it's declining until the post-9/11 wars begin. And it goes up to 85 million metric tons and then declines. And then what you see, those little fluctuations are actually operations changing in Iraq and Afghanistan, largely. So if you've got even more fine grain, and I do this in some of my analysis, which was too detailed to be in the book, I can track aircraft and emissions, and I can track it with it makes sense. It goes along with what the U.S. is doing doctrinally. Okay, so what's important from this chart and the next one is that when the U.S. is mobilizing, emissions are greater, but there's a peace dividend in emissions when the U.S. is demobilizing. So when emissions go down, when activities go down, emissions go down. Okay, but now let's think about this in another perspective. The U.S. military emits more CO2 than many nations, and Forbes did this little chart after the 2019 paper came out. So I like to show how I got Forbes to do a chart for me that I can use. Okay, the other thing we need to keep in mind is military industrial emissions, and I'm not going to talk a lot about that today, but it's important to think about this because military emissions are part of the story, but military industrial emissions are a significant part of emissions. Mostly what I'm talking about today are the military emissions, but military industrial emissions are about the same magnitude as military emissions. Okay, so it's hard to wrap your head around it. So about 15 to 17% of the United States industrial economy is military and aerospace. Then that's based on employment. Okay, so if you do that calculation, you get a number. I did it based, an estimate based on the emissions of the top 12 defense contractors. And you see on this chart some of them. Lockheed Martin is the largest, Northrop Grumman, General Dynamics, these are the big three. But I did the emissions of the top 12 and then interpolated, that is, did some extrapolation and extra math to get an estimate that tells me that military industrial emissions are as emitting as the DoD. So again, the size of entire countries like Denmark. Okay, so now the deep cycle, very quickly. The deep cycle is my notion, thinking about international relations as I do, as something that unfolds over hundreds of years, where institutions and ideas and material reality reinforce each other. What I'm trying to describe is how the military technology and military fuel use promoted military industrialization, changed commercial, that is civilian consumption and commercial industry, affected relations between the United States or any other country and oil-producing countries through bases and other kinds of arrangements, supplying weapons and so on. And I'll talk a little bit about action-reaction cycles. So how do we get there then? That's the theory. So how do we get there? We begin when the United States moves away from arms and legs, and all militaries move away from arms and legs and draft horses and so on, oxen, powering them, to when they get steam engines, for which are powered by coal, and so they move away from sort of natural power and the winds. So if the wind stops blowing, the ship is becalmed. So what fuel gives you is not just speed, but independence from nature. And so I describe this story in the book and the tight relationship between military industry, which is also using fossil fuels to make the weapons that you'll see depicted here. So Matthew Perry is an interesting figure. I have the Japanese depiction of basically the forced opening of Japan, because Perry is not just trying to open commercial relationships, but he's trying to get coal depots and a coal supply in the Far East. That's part of his mission. So the U.S. also depended on British infrastructure at this time, but the British, being the largest naval power, needed their own independent infrastructure in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And they are coincidentally, and not so coincidentally, reliant on the coal that they produce. You've heard coal and Newcastle, but coal is the thing that they have, which allows them to become dominant in this mode of transportation, steam-powered, at first, steamships that are using both sails and water wheels, but then engines with rudders and propellers that are powered by steam, and then later oil. So this is why people said in the 19th century that coal may be considered as the lifeblood of the man of war, and upon its supply depends their existence as a living factor in the battle equation. Here you see depicted the United States Navy's Great White Fleet, which makes a voyage between 1907 and 1908, circumnavigating the globe on coal, and they have to rely on the British to supply some of that coal, and they're trying to get local coal, and it becomes enlightening to the Roosevelt administration and later when they realize that they can't do it all themselves, and they have an incentive to get more coal that's controlled by the United States. And this is the ironically titled Great White Fleet, which is so dirty that they had to carry around extra cans of white paint because the coal would stick to the sides of the ship. So fast forwarding to World War I, Lord Curzon says the Allies floated to victory on a wave of oil. Of course, he's the leader of the House of Lords. He's in the War Cabinet. That's partially true, they did, but they were also still dependent on coal. There's a mixture there. And after the war, what you see is the development of United States Army Air Force and aerial refueling, and ships are no longer really alone in sucking up a lot of the fuel needs. Aircraft becomes much more significant. And then quickly, I want to say something about the role of oil in World War II. Clearly, the Japanese were unhappy when the United States cut off oil exports in June 1941. Oil was one of the things that the Japanese needed for their strategy, so they tried to get it from Manchuria in the 1930s, and they were successful. But they also had other parts of their conquest strategy driven by the need for oil. The U.S. is, of course, trying to stop their access to oil, and they start sinking the Japanese ships which have oil on them, going to Japanese military industry. In World War II, in addition, the Allies bombed the Germans, who were, because they were coal rich, they had to get oil from elsewhere. And this, what you see in the chart on the right is how important the bombing of German oil infrastructure was, and the great efforts that the United States took. But then they would build back up their oil infrastructure, and it was a cycle of bombing, and then they build it back up. Okay, so then the deep cycle is also at work in post-war technological and social innovations that are spurred by war, promoted by military industry. For example, commercial industry, the commercial aircraft industry is bolstered by the giving away of aircraft after World War I and World War II to the commercial airplane industry. The U.S. highway system in the 1950s is about evacuation from the threat of nuclear war. And it's also, the highway system is meant to facilitate military industry as well. You get plastics, you get ammonium nitrate, which was used in bombs, going to soil in the form of fertilizer, and then that becomes nitrous oxide, which is a potent greenhouse gas. It's almost 300 times more potent than carbon. In addition, there's deforestation that occurs in war that's deliberate and sometimes not. And this image is of the burning of the Shenandoah Valley in 1864, deliberate burning to try to bring misery to the Confederacy, but it happens to destroy lots of forest. And this destruction of forest was a part of the strategy of the war. And you also see here the way that trees were used, cut down and used to make roads, very quick roads. And this is remains of a Civil War, on the lower right, the remains of a Civil War corduroy road. Taking us up to the present, the consequences of attacking oil fields, which is a strategy that doesn't just end in World War II, but continues into the Iraqi deliberate destruction of their own and Kuwaiti oil facilities, to the United States destruction of ISIS oil infrastructure, and more recently, the deliberate, apparently, destruction of natural gas infrastructure, Nord Stream 1 and 2. And what you see here is the path of the pipeline, but those images are of bubbles of natural gas, which is mostly methane, a gas that is 24 times more potent, has a greater greenhouse gas intensity than carbon dioxide. Okay, and so this leaking will happen for another few weeks, apparently, of methane, even though there's no more gas being put into the pipeline. Okay, that's a lot of the big picture. And what I want to do now is describe how, I showed you that image of the British imperial system and their coal deposits. But here you see that the United States system this is Defense Logistics Agency distribution of fuel. And they say our footprint is global. It is. It's in every part of the world. They have this capacity to distribute, store, and distribute fuel, whatever kind is needed. Navy special fuel, jet fuel, diesel fuel, and so on. And these distribution centers are at bases and in close relationship with allies. And then here are the bases. So the logistics agency supplies these massive and sometimes small bases. And there's about 750 US overseas bases that they're in charge of getting fuel to. Okay, and here are some of the military operations the United States has been in, just post 9/11 war operations that are the pointy end of the US military doctrine. That's why we need that fuel. Okay, so now I'm going to summarize the deep cycle of fossil fuel use, growth, and military strategy. It begins with cheap and versatile oil. It then moves to civilian and military demand for petroleum. You get dependence and the production of infrastructure. You want to maintain supply. You don't want to be vulnerable. So your concern extends to threats in the future, for instance, political instability in producing countries, increasing price, and the possibility that oil may run out. So this insecurity about price, access, and diminished supply gets you to attempts to decrease insecurity. So you increase your military capacity and presence in areas like the Persian Gulf where oil is found, or in the 19th century in the Far East where you could find coal. You develop economic and diplomatic ties to oil producers. You choose winners and losers in those societies, and that can create instability itself. Then increased military spending, arms purchases, and the presence in oil and gas producing regions and lines of communication create their own vulnerabilities that you have to defend against. And then that may also cause increased instability. And then you have got, because you're doing all this, you've got increased fossil fuel consumption. But there's this way out that we often don't take, which is attempts to break the cycle of fossil fuel dependency, this deep cycle, by diversifying energy sources, using renewables, developing alternatives to fossil fuel technologies, and so on. And we could reduce consumption. There's an idea. Okay. So I told some friends I wouldn't look at my notes. I'm actually looking at them. Surprise, surprise. But I'm ahead of them because I didn't look at them. Okay. so that's the deep cycle. And what I'm showing here now, back to the big picture on fuel use. I said that the Navy was the big one. But then in the late 20th century, sort of after Korea, well, after World War II, Korea and Vietnam, the aircraft is the biggest user of fuel in the US military. And you also see on this chart, which was, I'm thanking the DoD for producing this, you see fuel use, energy use by area. So NORTHCOM at the bottom is where we are. We're in NORTHCOM. And then Central Command is basically the Middle East, Persian Gulf area. Pacific Command has been renamed to Asia Pacific Command, or I'm now losing it, but it's been renamed, but it's there. Pacific Command, there's European Command, and then there's unknown. They don't know where the fuel went. It's a mystery. And that's 4% in 2014. So, all right, how does the military think about national security and climate change? I want to tell you a couple things about how they think about it. First of all, they understand climate science. They anticipate its impacts, that is climate change impact on the institution itself, and they're concerned about climate change caused war coming to a neighborhood near you. So, how do they understand climate change? They paid for the research that tells us about it. Roger Revelle in 1956 is asking for money to understand the impact of increased warming in the Arctic. So he says, we are now the greatest maritime nation on Earth. If the Russian coastline increases by something like 2,000 miles or so, the Russians will become a great maritime nation. Therefore, he needs money to study climate change. Okay, that's the pitch at the hearing. And Revelle and co-author Hans Suess, in research funded by the Department of the Navy, write in 1957 in a scientific journal, human beings are now carrying out a large-scale geophysical experiment of a kind that could not have happened in the past, nor be reproduced in the future. Within a few centuries, we are returning to the atmosphere and oceans the concentrated organic carbon stored in sedimentary rocks over hundreds of millions of years. Some of these same people, including Roger Revelle, tell President Johnson that they're engaged in this experiment, and on and on. They tell Carter, and so on. Okay, fast forwarding to 1997, there's an opportunity in the international community to understand and reduce global greenhouse gas emissions. And it's negotiations in Kyoto. The Pentagon says they don't want anything. They want to be exempted from any emissions reductions or even reporting. Then they lobby. President Clinton agrees. Al Gore agrees. They get what they call everything they wanted in terms of not having reporting. This is a long quote. I won't read it. We can return to it. But essentially it's saying, the United States does not have to, nor does any other country, according to the Kyoto Protocol, say what its military emissions are. If they talk about military, any sort of military-related emissions, they can concatenate it, put it in with commercial aircraft emissions, for example, so you wouldn't know what was military, what was civilian. So this is the way it works. In 2015, at Paris, the far right was concerned that this would go away, this opacity, and they lobbied. And it's now voluntary that you can, that a country could tell their emissions from the military. They don't, for the most part, or they mix them in with their civilian emissions. Now, how else does the Pentagon think about it? Well, they're anticipating bad things happening to their bases. Bad things have already happened, and they've been studying this for a couple of decades. And here's one of their maps of the installations that are already suffering climate-related impacts. And here's an image from Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida. I don't know what the Air Force Base looks like now after Ian, or any of that infrastructure. We'll find out soon enough. But the Congress considered not repairing this because it was so damaged. And they decided to anyway at a cost of many millions of dollars. Here is Diego Garcia, a U.S. facility in the Indian Ocean, which we lease from Britain. It is vulnerable to sea level rise. Parts of it are only 8 feet above sea level, something like that. And that might be inaccurate since sea level is rising. Okay, how else do they think about it? They have responded by making a Great Green Fleet. Remember the Great White Fleet? The Great Green Fleet runs on a mix of 10% biofuel, mostly beef fat, and 90% petroleum. That's the Great Green Fleet. And they've also developed carinata seed, that is Ethiopian mustard, to put on aircraft. And there's a 50-50 mix. And in 2008, they showed that they could run their aircraft on this. And people in the Air Force are like, well, we proved it in 2008. Why don't we do this? Okay, that's a question. I need to fast forward to the rest of this because I want to hear what you have to say. But I'll just say that the other thing they're doing is promoting their sustainability. And they've actually, as I've said, succeeded in reducing their emissions at installations quite a lot. In fact, their reductions are so significant that they've already almost reached their target. In other words, and the Navy said that they would reduce their emissions completely and go net zero by 2050. They have reduced their emissions quite a bit. The Army said that they would reduce their emissions by 50% by 2030. When they published that number based on a 2005 baseline, they had already reduced their emissions by 42%. So they're very close. So there's one way to think about it. They've been ambitious. The other way to think about it is these goals are not ambitious. They're almost already there. All right, but the other thing that I wanted to mention is the securitization of climate change. People are scared that climate change war is coming to a neighborhood near them. And the DOD didn't used to say this, but now they do. The whole national intelligence estimate in 2021 focused on this, talked about climate change effects of different levels of warming, and talked about impacts to human security. And these are some, if you can read them. They talk about tropical cyclones, effects of biodiversity, effects of rising temperature, precipitation and flooding, causing people to move. Migration is a major concern that they focus on. And then assuming that there will be instability in vulnerable places, they think, as I said, climate change war may be coming to a neighborhood out there or maybe to you. Okay, so then what you see is the Navy, again, is in the lead, and they say that climate change instability is the threat that they think is more likely. This is Chief of U.S. Pacific Command in 2013, Locklear. It's more likely than other scenarios, including war with China. Okay, and even Secretary of Defense Mattis said needed to be concerned. In 2021, in preparation for the Glasgow meeting, the Conference of the Parties, there were 4 documents that came out of the government. There was a document by the DOD, their climate risk analysis. This is an image from that, where they're anticipating these are fists coming together. They're anticipating conflict in these locations where there's climate change caused stresses and more difficulty in the operating environment. They're saying that, and I'm going to read this one because it's vital here. As climate change converges with other drivers, especially geostrategic competition, emerging technology, and global demographic trends, it is reshaping the risk landscape. An increasingly accessible Arctic has already emerged as a competitive space with national security implications, including competition over resources such as fish, et cetera. The corrosive impact of these trends will make nations increasingly vulnerable to domestic insecurity, with sweeping implications for regional and border security and core national security interests of the United States, right? Simultaneously, revisionist nations will seek to exploit climate change-induced instability to erode the rules-based order that is central to the security and prosperity of the United States and its allies. So revisionist nations will seek to erode the rules-based order. That we're talking about there is Russia and China. And other unnamed threats. But then you see in the National Intelligence Estimate, another document that came out at the same time, the focus of their attention right there is Central Africa, which is a region that has produced the least greenhouse gas, but which will be affected greatly. And they're also looking at India, Pakistan, and some island nations as areas that will be highly vulnerable not just to climate change, but to conflict. So the question is that inevitable? Does climate change lead to war? The research shows that that's not necessarily so. It depends on how governments react to the stresses of climate change. And that's where I'm going to end.
Okay, thank you so much, Neta. And I'm going to make a few brief remarks, and then I'm going to begin a conversation with Neta. I have a series of questions, and then we're going to open up to you. And I'll try to keep it to the time I've been given. So first, this is an incredibly well-researched, clearly written, and persuasive book on two of the most important issues of our time: climate change and war, and the relation between the two. And it's really a visionary book, okay? It's a visionary book. So in addition to, you've heard about it, history, in addition to lots of numbers that really persuade us of what's going on, in addition to important theory, there's also a part about a way ahead. And so, but you really haven't talked about, so maybe one of the first question should be, what is the way ahead then? It gives, and in part, I want you to take this over, but in part, the way ahead is really how the US military needs to reimagine our national security, right? That this deep cycle you're talking about, as you say, is not inevitable. And it's based on certain doctrines and certain ways of thinking about security and the world that could take a different form. And so, here it is. It's real form. It's not even available in the bookstores yet. No. But I just highly encourage people to take a look at this book. The first part has these fascinating historical chapters, in great detail. I think it's really appropriate that it was a history professors who set up this environmental forum, because the history chapters of this book are really impressive. Then we have this section really telling us about how she gets these numbers in a way that recognizes how difficult it is to get these kind of numbers and how hard Neta has worked to do this, but also you recognize the things you can't tell us. So it leads you to have really great confidence in the kinds of numbers that you're telling us. And then this theorizing the deep cycle, which is really this very powerful center of this book, right? Is how it really feeds on itself. Right? And so the question is, when we have these, if you wish, vicious, I would say the deep cycle is a vicious cycle. The question is, how do we break that vicious cycle that we now have to be able to move in a more virtuous direction? And then Neta makes really important points about, sometimes you call it the irony, and sometimes you call it the tragedy of the fact that the US military is both leading research and early awareness. So these are not climate deniers. And even they have to kind of hide during the Trump administration that they're not climate deniers. They're not climate deniers, and yet at the same time, they refuse to even publish their own numbers about emissions for years, and they refuse to change their thinking about the issues. So we have this irony, tragedy, that despite not being climate deniers and despite doing early research on climate, nevertheless, they continue to be committed to this deep cycle. Okay, so I'm going to end there and start questions I have for you. And I think the first one I want to ask is really, you give a series of suggestions at the end of the book in what you call the way forward. And I wonder if you can just share some of those with us.
Okay, I think the most important thing I'm saying there is that for decades, the United States' reliance on Persian Gulf oil has been declining. Yet we still have thousands of troops in that region, and we have an aircraft carrier there almost 24/7, sometimes two. And that is in large part to protect access to the oil, but not just access, its price. So as the United States and other countries move to alternative fuels and continue decreasing their reliance on imported fuels, we could reduce that troop presence and move it from 25% to something very minimal. And in fact, because of the enormous capacity of the United States to project power, I don't think we need most of those troops, if any. The second recommendation I make is that there be another round of base realignment and closure. I talked about how in the 1990s, the emissions declined, and it's partly because there were 2,000 bases that the United States had all over the globe, and with the end of the Cold War, many of those were closed, and then we have through most of the post-9/11 wars, 800 bases all over the world. And now they're down to about 750 that the United States has left Afghanistan and is minimally involved there with drone strikes. So now we're about 750 bases, but the entire United States posture, depending on projecting power to meet threats that are caused by climate change, right, is, it's ironic, it's tragic. It doesn't have to be that. We could reduce those bases. And in fact, the DoD itself says they have 18% excess capacity at bases. They wanted base realignment and closure, and Congress didn't do it, and they've asked for it several times. In the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, in the Trump administration, they really stopped speaking about much, and I believe they still have 18, probably more, % capacity, excess capacity. So some of this is, I think, rethinking the necessity for these bases in light of changed foreign policy needs and commitments.
So two important things have happened since the book went to press, right? And I just would like you to reflect on the way forward given these two things. Yeah. One of them is, of course, the war in Ukraine, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which happened after the book went to press. And then the second one is just the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, this major climate act that finally got through Congress. And so I wonder whether either of those two affect the way forward. I think I would guess Russia negatively, because it'll make your base realignment and closure proposal more difficult. But maybe some of the aspects of the Inflation Reduction Act could have a positive impact.
Mm-hmm. Right. To the extent that the Inflation Reduction Act is focused on domestic, basically bolstering the renewable energy sector and encouraging us to switch, for instance, automobiles and get heat pumps and so on. That's great. It's a stimulus to that industry. But before this, the renewable energy was taking off already. This is just more demand. That's potential demand. I think that's excellent. Unfortunately, in December of last year, President Biden, in his executive order saying that the U.S. government should reduce its emissions dramatically, exempted agencies that dealt with national security. In other words, there is a national security exemption to emissions reductions. As I've shown, most of the government's emissions are for national security. So it's really working at cross purposes there, I think, but I have great hopes for the commercial side of that. People talk about how it is that we can use military innovation as a spark or a way to provide the technologies that we need in the transition to a clean energy future. I have two responses to that, which is we already had those. We have most of the technology we need. We just need to act immediately. And secondly, it's very inefficient to do it that way. The military is an extremely inefficient investor in research and development. But I think that this may be a sort of sop to the Republicans that we see, that they get more money to do this R&D. And then about the Ukraine war, obviously energy is at the center of it in terms of the Russian capacity to act. So as we diminish our reliance on, that is the Western countries, the European reliance on their oil and natural gas, we diminish their capacity to act. It's like sanctions, increasing their costs. And so I think that's a tool that does not demand a military response. Mm-hmm. And then also energy is at the center here in that the Russians have been attacking not just, they may have attacked their own pipeline, I think it's likely, but they've been attacking Ukrainian power infrastructure. And what that does is it means that Ukrainians that don't have electricity have to burn wood that they chop from forests. It's the same thing that Afghanis did and other societies do when they're at war. They replace the fuel with natural sources, and that has its own problems with deforestation, increasing, or rather decreasing the capacity for carbon sequestration. The Russian attacks on the nuclear facilities highlight the dependence. I think it's 60% of Ukrainian electricity came from nuclear facilities. They supplied a lot of Europe's and nuclear energy. I think it highlights the importance of having an international treaty and better standards here for what is a war crime and a crime on the environment. I think in the Geneva Convention's additional protocols, we already have what we need, but I think it'd be important to make those treaty, perhaps another treaty, and I think there's work being done on that, though I'm not up to speed on that.
Mm-hmm. So one question I have is if we can make the energy transition, including in the military, so that's a big if, okay? But might it lead to less war, or would we start fighting over places where strategic minerals, the ones that we need for batteries, in the future? So there was just a great New York Times article about the deep seabed and the fact that we finally are having mining of the deep seabed. And one of the things, the conflict on the deep seabed is going to be over these strategic minerals that are there that are needed for electric batteries. So is it possible that we could do a transition and yet have a new national security doctrine that would lead to another, and just like we move from coal to oil, are we going to move from dependence on other minerals that could lead to war? Entirely
Possible, and we may be going there now, but we could learn.
Yeah,
right. Humans can learn.
Yep.
And that's my hope. In that we could have bought every gallon of oil. Just the question is the price, right? And how much are you willing to pay for something, right? So we could buy the minerals that we need. You can have diplomatic and trade arrangements so that you don't have to fight over them. The same with water. Now, water is an issue between India and Pakistan. India and Pakistan fight each other regularly in little border skirmishes, but they don't fight over water because they have an agreement. So I believe that, yes, we could go down the militarization route, or we could think, as a world about using the other tools that we have, diplomacy, trade, and common sense. Because common sense tells me that the road to hell is paved with fighting over these resources. We don't have the greenhouse gas capacity to fight over those resources.
Mm-hmm. Right. So this is my last question. I'm going to turn to the audience here for their comments and questions. But you're a constructivist in international relations theory, right? That's how you've been someone who is concerned about the role of human consciousness on international affairs. And yet this book could be, one interpretation of this book is it's almost a realist account, or certainly an account that takes these national interests very much into account. And yet throughout the book is woven this thing that you just said, and that is we could think about this differently. The military could have different doctrine, right? And I just wondered if what you would, say, people will say, aha, we always knew all wars about oil, right? All of our wars are about oil, and now we just have proof from Neta Crawford. So how can we understand the constructivist part of your work?
Right. So why I did the history was to show us that there were other paths that could have been taken. But we chose these paths. We chose reliance on coal, we chose reliance on oil, and then we set up institutions. They just didn't appear. They weren't natural. The World Social Forum has this saying, another world is possible. Another world is possible, but another world was possible, right? And that's what I'm trying to show, is that military doctrine is how we think about it. National interest is how we think about it. We say that we need this, and we built institutions so that we're dependent on it, but we could deconstruct that. And it requires us, first of all, understanding the ways that, there's the fancy word imbricated, right? But that these institutions and ideas and doctrines are imbricated, right? Deeply intertwined. And what I'm hoping we can do with a better understanding is unwind that and think about how it is, through our, when in the book I talk about how, in 1973, Nixon says we need to get off oil dependency. And he says we need more research on alternatives. And there's a little bit of money that's thrown into alternatives. But then when you look at the money spent from 1978 to basically the present, most of the money is supporting nuclear power or fossil fuel. It is not looking at green energy. And the research and development was not put there. But another world was possible in 1973 if we had done that. And that's I'm not just a constructivist. I believe in it all. We need to understand the world we make. And then that world we make constrains our choices, our beliefs. And then, but we can unwind it. And that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you so much. So we're going to open this now for the audience Q&A, and I'm going to moderate that. So I guess I'm going to call on people if you raise your hands. But Mary here has the mic, and if you raise your hand, she'll pass it to you. Okay. So yeah, there's a question right back there. Yes.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Why don't you stand up? Why don't you give your name when you ask your question? Maybe just identify yourself.
Hello, thank you so much for being here. My name is Isabel. I'm a senior at the college studying climate change from a social, political angle. And I'm currently writing a thesis about climate migration in the South Pacific. And my angle thus far has been sort of reflecting on a trend I see where neoliberal incentives and economic policies are shaping the way migration pathways are being developed from countries like Kiribati to New Zealand and Australia. And when interviewing people in Wellington this summer, a lot of people from Kiribati were reflecting on sort of unrest back home in the islands, where there's more and more of a global presence from China for the Belt and Road Initiative, and also the United States now to build an embassy and counter that. And I'm curious, how do you think, particularly in this Pacific region, climate migration, islands going underwater, the decision to relocate populations will sort of be treated by U.S. military interests? Do you think that the United States Army would like to add more bases like in this area that might promote more like migration pathways or sort of lead to more displacement against people's will. It's a really nascent issue, of course. I'm looking forward to reading your book, but yeah.
Thanks for the question. I think that the military looks at these patterns of migration in two ways. One as a possible source of instability, and the other is they may have the capacity through sea lift and airlift to help, and they may be called upon to do that, just as they're called upon to fight fires in the far west or to respond to natural disasters such as hurricanes. And they don't like that, they resent that, right? Because it takes them away from their core mission, even as they realize they have the best capacity. So talk about the development of an institution. So we develop an institution with the capacity to do something. It's the military, which is extremely inefficient at what it does because of the very specific requirements of a military. And then it's the only institution we have, or one of the only institutions we have with the capacity to act. So they resent the days away from training, and they resent the diversion of resources, yet they salute and they show up when needed, and they do a fine job at rescuing people and responding. And they are part of the first response in the United States and maybe elsewhere. But I think that the scenario that you're talking about is they've anticipated, and it's migration leading to conflict. Will it lead to more military bases? Potentially. But I think how it will be understood as part of the way that Asia-Pacific Command thinks about other threats. The Chinese presence in the region could increase. Right now, China has one overseas base, very far away from there, but they could get more bases. And why do they have the one base they have? To ensure access to oil. Right, so if we helped China, by the way, develop other ways, and they're doing fine without our help, with renewable energy, they would be less anxious about access to oil. But so you need oil for mobility, right? You don't need oil to power industry. Right? So if the Chinese focused on domestic development in their economy and did not increase military forces, they would have reduced demand and less insecurity about Persian Gulf oil. Is that making sense? Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yes, next question. Okay, so yes, there's another question right here, I think really right next to the person who just spoke. And then I'll move to this side of the room. I see there's pent-up demand.
Hi, my name is Saman. I'm a first year at the college, and I'm wondering, since climate change and energy independence are such divisive wedge issues in America, how come we haven't leveraged the relative success of military decarbonization as a standpoint for driving bipartisan conversation in American political media and global news outlets?
Well, the military didn't want to talk about this during the Trump administration, because the Trump administration essentially banned the words climate change from reports. So they talked about it during the Trump administration and also in previous administrations as increasing efficiency. And increasing efficiency is good because it decreases your vulnerability along lines of communication. So they've been sort of doing this because they like that increased efficiency and decreased vulnerability. I think that as I'm trying to be really clear, that I don't think that the military should be leading in technology for the reasons I stated. We already have the technology that we need to make a transition, yesterday. And they're very inefficient. And why are they inefficient? I keep saying that. They're inefficient because when they build an aircraft that has to fly at 40, 50,000 feet, and then launch something, they need aircraft, very high tolerances, lightweight. They fly at Mach 2. Commercial aircraft are going to 300 miles an hour, the most. What they have is very specialized, expensive equipment. So when they build something, let's say, going to go to a desert or going to go up in the atmosphere, it's engineered beyond what the average civilian needs. And that's why I say it's inefficient to do it that way. And so they have great light batteries and solar panels and so on, but we could also use commercial. In fact, they buy some of their green tech from off the shelf commercially.
Yes, so over here on this side of the room, do we have just one? Okay, let's start in the back since Mary's headed to the back there. Right there.
Hello, and thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I am Alex Godoy. I am visiting scholar at the Weather Health Center, member of the IPCC report and the last report. And I would like to ask you two questions. One is one comment about the supply chain, because always the focus is scope 1, well, the fuel oils consumption, and maybe electricity. But what happened with the supply chain for the war? Because finally you are getting more minerals and so on, and you are importing carbon footprint from the overseas. And the second one is what happened in the future if you produce your own hydrogen to produce, I don't know, e-fuels. E-fuels is to replace the fuel of the investment. And maybe this is an energy independence of the war of the, and you mentioned that the war is for the control of the key materials, and one of the key materials is the fuel oil right now. What happened in the future if the United States get the energy independence by electric fuels using hydrogen and carbon capture and so on?
Well, not all of everything is oil or climate change, so I don't want to generalize too much. But let me just take your first question first. The scope 1 emissions that I was talking about, scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, which is scope 1 emissions are the emissions that are used directly. Let's say like when a tank drives down the street and it gets 10 gallons per mile or something, which is what they do, they get gallons per mile. Or aircraft, gallons per mile, right? So that's the emissions from that. Okay, and then, or sometimes it's miles per gallon, but, and the scope 2 are the energy that goes into the institution. So that would be like when the DoD buys electricity produced from a coal-fired plant. And they're really the only part of the government, by the way, that still uses coal-fired plants. Okay, scope 3 is the supply chain that you mentioned. And I estimate the supply chain emissions for military industry and include that for the top 12 defense contractors in the US. But I think that the supply chain emissions are much greater. There are hundreds of these supply chain companies. I think that's part of what you were asking. And then about e-fuels, we have an expert here. I would defer to the expert, Nathan, but just let me, if I screw it up, Nathan, you'll pop right in. Okay, this may work. Hydrogen may work. So if the United States gets to be independent in terms of hydrogen, could we maintain the foreign policy we have? Yes, we could. Because the DoD has two jobs. One, it's to defend our borders. We happen to live behind what my dissertation advisor called moats, right? The Atlantic and the Pacific, and we're pretty invulnerable. And but still, it's to defend the continental United States and its outlying provinces like Hawaii, which I'd love to visit, and if anyone can get me there, and Alaska and so on, and Puerto Rico. So that's the first mission, defense. The second mission is power projection to enforce U.S. Desires about the way the world should work. It's moral desires, it's economic desires, it's political view of how the world should work. And this projection of power is what the military mostly does. And that's what those 13 aircraft carriers are all about. Okay, could we keep doing that with e-fuels? Yes, we could. So it's not necessarily the case that all of US foreign policy would change if the military converted. A leaner, greener military does not give you a new world unless you unravel some things which I haven't talked about, which are, our assumptions about it is good, just, virtuous, and right to run the world as the world's only superpower, and whacking down the other two.
Great. So can we come to a couple of people here in the front who've been raising their hands right there?
Hello, my name is Ishan. I am a first year at the college. And my question was more regarding the hot zones, which you mentioned that are at risk for climate war, which were identified by the US military, that in the future years, they might be the most risk for climate war. So beyond identifying these zones, what else is the US military thinking about doing about these zones to prevent these wars from breaking out?
Right, so the United States started Africa Command about 20 years ago. And Africa Command will try to enforce stability but most of what Africa Command is doing is counterterrorism and bolstering governments which keep stability in those areas, those countries. And again, it doesn't have to be that way. The counter-terror strategy actually increases tension because it supports governments which are not necessarily popular with their people. And this is the same story that we saw in the Middle East, with Iran and supporting the Shah. It was not popular. So Africa Command is a US solution to this instability, and they're going to be ready to take it on. I'm not thinking that that's necessarily going to work. I think we could go other ways, which are, as I've described, different kinds of development. And also, that diagram from that Mach paper that I had towards the end, where it talks about the capacity of governments to deal with instability is what potentially prevents too much water, too little food from leading to conflict. It's governmental capacity which could be bolstered, and that can happen through economic assistance and development, other means rather than military force.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, right here in the front.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much for this talk. I just wanted to go back on a comment you made and ask for more details, if you can give them. So I wanted to go back on a comment you made. You spoke about the role of the support of far-right governments or the far-right in the 2015, I suppose, Paris negotiations for the exception of the military and disclosing their greenhouse gas emissions.
I didn't say far-right governments. I said
far-right.
Yeah, conservatives in the United States were against changing the Kyoto rules.
Oh, okay. And can you, was it also worldwide or was it mostly US specific? I'm curious about the public dynamic essentially at play, to the extent there is a public dynamic on this topic given the novelty of this data.
I actually don't know. And what I can say is I think that the British government also doesn't announce all of its emissions, so that they do a better job than the US. There are people who work in European NGOs that are looking at the emissions from NATO and EU countries, and they have a very hard time getting that data. So I don't believe that there's a lot of openness following this, but I actually don't have the answer to, through direct evidence. I haven't looked at that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. One over here. Yeah, right. I think the gentleman in the there in the blue shirt.
My name's Ogden. Here's what I read this morning, that the attempt to blow up Nord Stream is releasing natural gas, which is the equivalent of something like 2 hours of the total pollution caused worldwide in XYZ amount of time. But the point behind Nord Stream was to import natural gas from Russia, because also in this article is that methane has a 20-year decay period, whereas carbon dioxide can last in the atmosphere for 500 years. So the tendency to go towards nat gas was inspired by the Paris Accords to get away from coal and oil. And the problem with that was, strategically, it put them in the laps of the Russians. And because they didn't have any other source of nat gas, and the problem now is they don't have any source of nat gas to supplement the losses. And as a result, they are in fact beginning to cut down the forests once again in Europe, because they're incredibly concerned that they won't have heating this winter. And the other ramification of that is that our own cost of natural gas, especially in the Northeast, is increased by 77%.
Okay.
So the question there is, if there was diplomacy involved in the Ukraine war to a greater degree than there had been during the buildup, could it have been avoided? Or was it indispensable that it would not be avoided from a certain point of view? But from the standpoint of utilization of nat gas, it should have been avoided.
I just want to say something about natural gas as the so-called bridge fuel that people talk about. It's supposed to get you from coal and oil. You know, it's going to sort of it's like tiding you over. It's like having a snack before dinner, right? So that you can see natural gas as a less polluting form than coal, right? Less emissions. I think that we have a society have done that. The natural gas industry has told us it's good, it's clean, and so on. It actually, is a very greenhouse gas intensive process. There's lots of leaks. Talk about the leaking from Nord Stream that is deliberate. There's lots of unintentional leaking of natural gas from the flaring at production sites for oil to the natural gas compressors like Weymouth. At Weymouth, it's just natural gas is not as clean as we think. It's not, in fact, natural. It's methane, right? So CH4 is extremely greenhouse gas. Its global warming potential is quite high. Okay, the great thing about methane is you stop producing it, it does get out of the atmosphere. Okay, and relatively quickly. And a lot of methane is actually agricultural methane, right? So we've got methane issues all over that we could be dealing with, and it would make a great contribution to decreasing the most horrific aspects of climate change if we could reduce methane very soon. But methane is not a big part of my story. Natural gas is part of the story. And could the war have been avoided? Most wars could be avoided unless you've got somebody who's determined to make war no matter what. So I don't know if that war could have been avoided. It does have the consequences that you're talking about.
So we have time for one more question. So I know there's someone who's had his hand up right here for quite a while, and that'll be our last question.
I'll stick around for a minute.
Hi, Professor Crawford. Hi, everyone. I am a senior at the college. I live in Winthrop House, not across, but somewhere here near the river. And yeah, I've also been thinking about sort of climate change and national security recently. But the way I've been thinking about it is to look at precedents in history. And so two particular cases that I think about is one, a case that Eric Klein wrote about. I think it's published by Princeton University Press, called 1177 BC, the year civilization collapsed. And it's a little, bombastic, the title, but the book I found actually quite compelling, where he talks about how, about 11 centuries before the Common Era, in the East Mediterranean, there were many different nations that were deeply interconnected, and all the records that we have agree that there was a series of natural disasters in that region, and that at the same time, so-called sea peoples, in all of these reports, they're called sea peoples, exploited those advantages and tried to invade, and that ensued in sort of a catastrophe.
I'm going to ask you to, given this is we're almost out of time,
and then
to be more
there are also
precise.
two cases in African history, in the Nile, between the Kush kingdom and the what will become the Egypt kingdom, and later, and also in the Niger-Congo at a similar age before the Common Era, of wars that started because of resource deficiency, but went in seriously different paths. So in Egypt, it actually led to the fall of an empire, and in the Niger-Congo, it actually led to increased resource sharing and cooperation between different communities.
Right.
So, to shorten my question, have you looked at historical precedent? What do you think about these examples, if you are aware of them at all? Thank you.
I'm not aware, I don't know the cases that you're talking about, so I won't talk about them, but I will talk about one thing that I find really interesting. It's called the Great Dying. In the conquest of the Americas by the Europeans, especially of South America, the conquistadors is decimated, reduced to 10% within 100 years. The people of South and Central America. And when that occurred, reforestation happened because these were highly agricultural societies with lots of areas of land under cultivation. And scientists have shown that there was a dip in global average temperature because of this reforestation. So I find that an amazing and interesting instance of conquest leading to climate change, but in this case, cooling. But I don't know the other cases you're talking about.
So I'm going to take the position of chair, and in the remaining 2 minutes, I'm going to ask you one final question. And that is, you make a super important point in your book that the military believes that climate change will lead to war, but the social science literature doesn't necessarily agree with them. And I wonder if you just share that social science literature view to this conviction that the military and many members of the ordinary public have, that climate change will inevitably lead to war.
Right. So there are many academics who've been working the last 30 years. One of them is Tad Homer-Dixon, who I actually went to graduate school, who argues that resource wars are going to crop up. And he's at the University of Toronto, and he has a whole group of people who, a crop of his students who've been arguing this, that resource tensions will lead to conflict. So that's the resource war school. The other school is that migration, the other argument is migration will lead to instability and that will lead to conflict. what social scientists have done is they've looked at these places where they said that there was, a resource caused conflict, or, migration led to war, and said the causal pathways were much more complex. So there may have been government repression and a pre-existing movement, as in Syria. Mm-hmm. And when people moved from the countryside because of drought and famine, yes, they fit into a pre-existing movement that was trying to change the political situation in Syria. The drought and famine did not cause the movement. In other words, people have agency. And so that's part of what the social science is showing, is they're complexifying the causal pathways and showing us that it's not necessarily a straight line from resource insecurity and to conflict. And there's also research that shows that there's the capacity for cooperation in resource scarce situations. And we have, anthropologists have looked at this as well. And I think of the Kung in Southern Africa as an example of more cooperation in the face of resource scarcity in the Kalahari Desert. But we debate it as academics because it is so complex. And but what the military has done is sort of taken on this narrative of climate wars, and that is a way, I think, to get resources. And also, I think they're genuinely anxious about it because that's their job. They're to look for threats.
Okay. Well, on that note, I want to thank Neta Crawford very much for her important book, for this interesting discussion, and I want to thank the audience too for your thoughtful questions. So.
All right, thank you.